Welcome everyone. Today I'm asking the question, what is sin? One of the problems that I have had in approaching the question of sin is the understanding of sin as a judgment upon me by some external authority according to a rigid dogma and doctrine. Images of the Spanish Inquisition or the witch trials come to mind, where sin is thought of in the context of a religious authority judging and damning and persecuting someone because they are a sinner, because they sin, because they have transgressed a divine law. Therefore, a conversation about sin can bring up a certain defensiveness, a certain feeling of being judged by a religious institution or something like that. And what I would like to say from the outset in this presentation is that I'm going to approach the question of sin in a bit of a different way. To do this, I'm drawing in large part on Eastern Orthodox theology, which I would say approaches the question of sin from within instead of from without. So all of these this fear and suspicion about the language of sin, I would say, comes from an approach to sin from without, feeling that we are being judged by others according to a certain dogma and a certain religious code, and we are being damned as sinners in such a context. Instead, what I'm learning from Eastern Orthodox theology is that there is an approach to sin from within, which means from the heart, or we could say from a soul's eye perspective. So what I'd like to do is emphasize right from the beginning that this presentation about sin is speaking to you, the viewer, directly, and speaking to you from the perspective of how your life is organized, the phenomenology of it, how your experience is structured, how your psychology, your psyche, your mind, your soul, using a lot of different words there, but from your inwardness, how your inwardness is oriented, how it is structured. And we're going to start from that place, from a psychological place, and we're going to walk through how we are inwardly oriented, how our desires lay themselves out. And we're going to see if we can approach the question of sin from that perspective and see if we can inwardly relate to the meaning of sin. And I think this is particularly powerful because the meaning is really the point here. I want you, the viewer, to come to an inward understanding of what sin means, to connect it to your own thoughts, words, and actions, to connect it to how your life is lived and how it is organized and how it is structured. And so, in that sense, the approach to sin I'm taking in this presentation is a psychological one. It's also a theological one. It's also a metaphysical one. But first and foremost, and perhaps fundamentally, the level at which we can understand how this presentation unfolds is a psychological one. And the reason for that, as I've just said, is the emphasis on relatability and meaning, and really having our heart in it, having our understanding in it from within. So I think I've said, I think those preliminary remarks will be adequate. I think one of the problems with approaching the question, what is sin, is the kind of atmosphere of judgment and being judged, and the kind of damnation, and all of that of the outward or extrinsic understanding of an approach to sin. Whereas what I would like to do in this presentation is approach it from within. I'd like to approach it psychologically, from the perspective of the soul. Final remark before we get into it. I'd like to approach this with the deepest humility. This presentation is a presentation from my perspective, as I understand things in my ignorance, from the perspective that I can approach things. I have been reflecting on this question, what is sin, for some time, and I'd like to share with you where my thinking is at with it at the moment, and how I see it from an inward perspective. And hopefully that will be illuminating. But I have a deep respect for the traditions, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Catholic, and the Christian theological traditions upon which I am drawing in this presentation. And I would suggest to research into those traditions yourself as well, because they are many centuries old, and they're deep and grounded in certain ancient understandings, and thus I want to approach this in a spirit of humility and say that this is by no means a complete or exhaustive answer to the question of what is sin, but it is instead a sharing of what I understand of it from my current level of perception, let us say. So let's get into it. So first, let's introduce a couple of Greek words, which I think would be really helpful in giving us a grammar or a framework in which to understand sin. The first is telos, and telos means aim, goal, end, or purpose. And I've put this bullseye with the arrow in it as the image to represent telos. And this really means, well, what I've said here, the aim, the thing towards which we aim in life. So we aim towards many different things. We aim, let us put it this way, there are our desires, our soul is organized according to different I don't know the plural. Let's just say different aims, these different telos. For example, I'm hungry. My aim is to eat. My aim is to satisfy that desire for food. And so the telos is the food, to satisfy the hunger. Or a business, for example, could be organized according to a telos, an aim, a purpose, to solve a particular problem, to accomplish a certain end. And so telos can operate at many different levels, at the individual level, at the social level, but it's really about desire and about that towards which we are oriented. Let me put it that way, because we are oriented towards many different aims, many different ends. That is the complexity of the human personality, as we pursue this thing and 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 this thing, and we move towards that, we aim at that, we use our eyes to orient towards that. For example, the telos of this presentation is to present an understanding of sin, to answer the question, what is sin? So I wanted to introduce that concept, telos, aim, goal, end, or purpose. And we're going to dive deeper into its meaning as we progress. And I wanted to present another Greek word, hamartia, which means to miss the mark or to err. And it is this word, as I understand it, which we find in the New Testament. This is what our translation of sin, when we use the word sin, it is equivalent to this Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark or to err. And so if our telos is our true aim, then hamartia is our off aim. So the telos is the true, our aiming true, and hamartia is our aiming off, our aiming false. And so this phenomenological framework or psychological framework is really helpful in understanding what is meant by sin, because the implication is that there are true and good and wholesome and healthy aims, and there are those which miss that mark and which take us off onto different wild straying directions, which there are aims which take us away from the telos, away from what Plato called the good, the true, and the beautiful. And it is an awareness of these other possibilities, these other pathways upon which we can tread in this life. Those other pathways are basically walking in sin, walking in error, and missing the mark in some sense. Of course, a central assumption in all of this is that there is, in fact, a mark, which is what I'm going to argue in this presentation. I'm going to suggest an approach to an ultimate telos, an ultimate aim. And I'm going to try to show why it must be true that there is an ultimate telos, an ultimate aim. And I'm going to try and show that in a negative sense. I'm going to try and show what sin is, answer the question, what is sin? What does it mean? What does hamartia mean? What does it mean to err, to walk away from? And I wonder if we can explore what it means to sin, then perhaps we can then intuit and understand through the negative what the positive is, what the absence of sin is, or the tempering and staying from the path of sin is, to walk true and to have our aim true and to be pursuing an ultimate telos. This question over whether there is in fact an ultimate telos is a deep critique which has been made on Christian theology, I would say, over the last few centuries. In particular, postmodernism has made a deep critique of the notion of ultimate telos or ultimate purpose or grand narratives or truth, we could say, even the idea of truth, the idea that there is a true telos, a true path, has been subject to much criticism and debate in recent generations and recent times. I don't want to enter too deeply into I would say like a debate of those ideas. Instead, what I would like to do is approach Christian theology from a position of humility and from a position of from a position of saying, I, as a modern person, do not understand much that is in this tradition. Let me enter into it with some faith and some humility and see if I can understand and go back to the roots of what is meant by some of these ideas, which is why we're looking at Telos and Hamartia, etc. And yes, hopefully, through the course of this presentation, I can show you I can show you the psychological reality of sin or hamartia and straying from, and thereby intuit and suggest its opposite, the ultimate telos, the truth, we could say. So let's continue. So here are two ideas. Yeah, these are two symbols which help to lay the grammar and the framework and the foundation of our thinking and our understanding in relationship to the question of sin. And these are the symbols of heaven and earth. And I've put here a list of kind of opposites or associations with these symbolic concepts. So heaven is the ideal, earth is the fact. Heaven is the invisible, earth is the visible. Heaven is the word, earth is the flesh. Heaven is the spirit, earth the body. Heaven in principle, earth in reality. Heaven intuition, earth sensation. Heaven above, earth below. So these are symbols, symbolic categories, which will help us in understanding what is meant by sin. And the case I'm going to make and what I'm going to suggest is that the ultimate telos in Christian theology is Christ, or God, but I think more specifically Christ, and that the lower order telos, the lower order aims or desires, which are forms of hamartia, missing the mark of Christ, missing the ultimate aim, are passions. And the passions is the word used for sin in Eastern Orthodox theology, as I understand it. And the passions come from the earth, essentially, from sensation, from the body, from the will of the flesh. Another way we could think of these symbols is that earth is the horizontal dimension, the spirit of the times, the spirit of the body, and heaven is the vertical dimension, the spirit of eternity, the spirit existing beyond the temporal, beyond mere time. And you'll notice I just did the image of the cross there, with the horizontal and the vertical, and the cross again is the central symbol of Christianity, and I would say that the relationship between heaven and earth is there in the symbol of the cross. Earth being the kind of across and the horizontal and the extended, and heaven being the above and below, the spiritual. And so I'm talking here about ontology. I'm talking about the theory of being, a vision of being. And what is being intuited in these symbols of heaven and earth and the symbol of the cross is that there is an ontology which is extended in the earth, and there is an ontology which reaches up and reaches down. So there's rabbit holes all over this presentation in terms of many different ideas to pursue, and I'd like to try and keep on topic and on the theme. But hopefully the introduction of these categories will be helpful. Yeah. Let me try and flesh out these symbols a little bit more. Heaven is the invisible. Thought is invisible. We haven't measured thought yet. We haven't given thought a locality in space and time. Science is unable to touch thought because it is beyond the perception of our senses. And when I say our senses, I'm saying sensation in this earth category below, the eyes of the body, the ears, our ability to touch and to taste, etc. Thought is beyond sensation. It is invisible in that sense, and it is intuitive in that sense. And yet it is real, because it's real in the sense that it structures our entire culture. The whole edifice of our culture is written in the language of thought. And yet thought is not of the earth. So that's maybe how I might approach these notions of heaven and earth. They're not these really esoteric concepts, really. They are very real and very practical to you, the viewer, because you have thoughts every day, and through the communication of thoughts, through the operation of what in Greek is called the logos, the communicative capacity of thought, we can transform each other's minds and inform each other through not matter, not stuff that is able to be perceived through the senses of the body, but instead by some other factor. And that other factor is rightly called spirit or spiritual, or intuitive, the word, the logos, etc. So the whole realm of interiority, of spirit, of the heart, of the soul, of the inwardness of the human being could be captured in this image of heaven. And the categories of fact, what we can indeed measure, what is indeed quantifiable. This is more the domain of science. What can we empirically test and validate? If we've got a hypothesis, an ideal in the mind, But how can we test that? How can we validate that? How can we flesh that out and give that more weight? Well, we can do that through empirical data, through testing, through experiment, and through the accumulation of empirical data. So we can bring the perceptions of our bodily senses into harmony with our hypothesis, and then we have a scientific theory, for example. And so maybe I'll leave it there with these categories, but I'd like you to keep in mind these ideas: telos, or aim, or end, or purpose; hamartia, which is the missing of a true aim, but hamartia is a certain telos in itself, because we pursue something else. We are distracted by another aim, but we lose sight of the true aim, the ultimate aim. And hamartia being the another word for sin, essentially, it's actually the Greek word for sin in the New Testament, being that which how we err, how we walk in error, how we miss the mark. Yes, so here back to the idea of the ultimate telos, which I've alluded to a minute or two ago. The ultimate telos in Eastern Orthodox theology is what is called theosis. And theosis is really the process of divinization, or becoming as God. I want to be very careful of what I say here, because the idea is not that we become God, but that we become, I'm going to get into it in a few slides time, but the idea is that we are made in the Imago Dei, is the Latin term, the image of the deity, the image of God. This is from Genesis, and that our soul is really wrought in that image. That is the true form of who we are. That is the true, pure form of who we are in our deep interiority, in the deep inner self. And so theosis is really about recovering and restoring that image of the divine, and it is through that image, through that divine capacity of the human soul, that we come into communion with and relationship to God and Christ. So some definitions of theosis: a transformative process whose aim is a likeness to or union with God. So there's something very mystical about this ultimate aim of theosis. It's about a mystical union between our soul, our heart, and God, or the source of our being, or ultimate reality. Another definition could be a restoration of the Imago Dei, the image of God within the soul, as I've just explained. And it is accomplished through some more Greek words: catharsis, purification, and theoria, illumination. So there's kind of a negative purging element, and there's a more positive visionary element. And we're going to explore all of these ideas more in the presentation. So that's just a bit of a summary of what to expect. But this point needs to be made before we proceed. And it's what I'm arguing, is that there is in fact an ultimate telos, an ultimate aim, an ultimate purpose, an ultimate end, an ultimate goal. And that is one of the central ideas of Christianity. That is the central notion at the heart of Christian theology is that there is indeed an ultimate telos. As I've said, this notion of the ultimate telos has been deeply critiqued in modernity and postmodernism, and the fragmented intellectual landscape of recent generations have been really trying to critique and unravel this notion of an ultimate telos. And as I've already laid out, I'm not going to address the postmodern critique in a head-on way. Instead, I'm attempting a hermeneutic of faith. I'm trying to look at the tradition of Christian theology with humility and try to capture the original vision, try to see through the eyes of those who wrote the Bible, and to try and understand the worldview of Christian theology from within. So this notion of the ultimate telos is central, and of course another word for the ultimate telos is God, or Christ, specifically in Christianity. The thing that sets it apart from other monotheistic traditions is the figure of Christ, the personality of Christ, the life of Christ. Like, Christ is unsurprisingly the center point of Christianity, and the symbolism we've just talked through about the heaven and the earth, the word become flesh, and the heaven being the vertical axis and earth being the horizontal axis, and the conjunctio, the union of those dimensions in a locale or a nexus. That's kind of what is suggested by Christ, is that Christ is the cross, and the cross is where heaven and earth come together, where the ideal and fact meet, where the invisible and visible meet, where the word and the flesh meet, where the spirit and the body meet, etc., etc. So let's move on. Yes, okay. So the ultimate telos, from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, is this theosis, and theosis is the union of the soul with God and a restoration of the Imago Dei. So what this Imago Dei is a Latin term, so I'm not sure if that's used in it's probably not used in Eastern Orthodox theology, because that's more rooted in the Greek versus the Latin. But the notion is the same. It's there in Genesis. The Christian notion is the same, that human beings are made in the Imago Dei, the Latin term, in the image of God. So that there is a nature, a character of our true self. I don't know if that's the proper language, but like our deep interiority is we have a certain nature. So we have a certain spiritual nature, and the concept I'm going to introduce now is another Greek word, is the nous, or the nous, I think it's pronounced. And the nous is the understanding, and it's a spiritual principle within us. And I've written some things which I understand about the nous. So the nous is the capacity for understanding spiritual reality. The nous is that within us by which the transcendent is known. The nous is intuition, imagination, vision. The nous is perception of what Plato called the good, the true, the beautiful. So the nous is the foundation for the moral life, for the intellectual life, and for the aesthetic life. for ethics, science, and the arts, we could say. And Nous is the way by which we know God. If God is understood as the underlying reality behind such notions as the good, the true, and the beautiful. So I would like to associate this notion of the Nous as that by which heaven is known within us. So I've given a bit about the symbol of heaven here, the ideal, the freedom, truth, love, some of these ideals of the human heart. How are we really to know them? Well, I don't think it's by facts. I don't think it's by looking into the structure of atoms or chemicals or anything which appears via our senses. It's not through the lens of earth that we are to know the meaning of love or truth or beauty or God, or these big words, these big ideals. It is instead by another way that we come to them, and it is an intuitive way. It's through another eye. It is another way of seeing. It is through another sight that these things are known. And so in Eastern Orthodox theology, this capacity is like a spiritual organ, we might say. Like we've got a physical organ, which is the heart, which is the source and center in many ways of the life of the body is the heart. Well, perhaps there is if the heart is the symbol on earth, perhaps the heavenly symbol for that is the heart of the inner person, the heart of the soul. And so it's like an organ. So we could think of the nous as an organ like the heart. And it is the organ of spiritual understanding. It is the organ which brings us into communion with divine, transcendent, spiritual, sacred realities. And again, I'm throwing out a lot of different words here, which people may have issue with. But again, I just would like to point to the fact that thought itself is beyond sensory perception. So the whole inwardness of what we call psyche or mind is necessarily spiritual, or is non-material. And so to approach notions of truth, beauty, freedom, liberty, a lot of these ideals that are really the foundation of our culture, especially the culture of the country I live in. Let me just try and be humble and just say, like, the values in the fabric of the United Kingdom, of England, where I live, some of the values that are really at the heart of the political, legal systems and structures that have been erected in this country I live in, they are undergirded, or they sit upon the foundation of spiritual principles, or upon ideals. And so nous is our understanding, our ability to it's like connecting to the divine mind, or something like that. Another word for it is the logos, but the logos is perhaps a bit of a different principle, because if we can intuit the idea of truth, say, then perhaps the logos is the principle by which that idea descends into earth and can be communicated and be expressed. And so the intuition is kind of the way by which we see and intuit certain realities, and the logos is the principle by which we communicate them. But yes, this nous notion is another deep idea, and there's many directions I could take this presentation, but I really would like to try to pursue it to the end and to stick with the theme. So this, get back on track then, this nous, this understanding, this capacity for understanding God, for knowing God, is the heart, is the spiritual core of our being, and it is associated with heaven, or the kingdom of heaven is all associated with this mystical inner principle by which we know and come into communion with spiritual realities. And that is the ultimate telos, the ultimate aim in Eastern Orthodox theology, is to restore and to vivify and to heal that organ, really. Because the notion is that the nous can become diseased. And so this is how the Orthodox approach the notion of sin, is more as a disease of the nous, instead of the transgression of a divine law, by which I'm going to judge you because you've broken the divine law. Instead, it's like you've got an organ of spiritual perception, the image of God within you, the nous, and it's become diseased, taken away from the wholeness which is inherent to its nature. And so it's just like, you could think in the analogy of heart disease, I guess. Heart disease is a medical, are forms of medical pathology, of disease of the heart of the body. Whereas perhaps we could think of sin as a spiritual disease as the disease of our spiritual heart. And so another term for sin is the passions. This is the Orthodox term, the passions. And so here I've written a few things about it. Sin is a disease or corruption of the nous, the understanding. It blinds us to vision of the transcendent. So this ability to see what is true, those kind of eureka moments of life, like, aha, yes, this is how it is, or to know the mystery of love, or to have a sense of what is beautiful, or to understand the mystery of God, like some of these deep eternal questions of the human soul. We lack a vision of any of that. We're blind to that. It's like that perception, that ability is shut off, closed, obscured, corrupted. And so thinking of it in terms of a lack of vision, an absence of transcendent vision, is a helpful way of thinking about our condition, or when we live in sin, when we are in the grip of the passions. It's associated too with sensation, materiality, and desire. Blindness to the good, the true, and the beautiful, as I've said, and ignorance of God. So I hope this is clear. To recap, we have the notion of the telos, the aim, the end, the purpose. We have the notion of hamartia, the missing of the mark, the missing of the aim, the end, the purpose. And then we've talked a bit about what that aim, the end, the purpose is. It is, in Christian theology, Christ or God, or that's the kind of ultimate metaphysic of it. But in terms of our own personalities, our own souls, it is the nous, it is the understanding, it is the heart, our ability to come into communion with transcendent principles realities. And finally, we're thinking of sin and the passions as a disease of that heart, a disease of our spiritual heart, a disease of our organ for spiritual perception. So how does sin come into being, we might ask? Okay, so let's get a bit deeper into the theory. This is as I understand it, at least. So we can think of this. The telos of natural desires. We have certain desires as human beings. And these are earthly desires which are necessary for our existence in the world. Necessary but not sufficient, but necessary. And these desires, these natural desires, are the desire for sex, for sexual contact, the desire for food, just the desire to eat, the desire for resources. We could say in the modern world for money, for property. But even our ancient ancestors, the equivalent would have been maybe land, or just different things that, or home, etc. So property in the broad sense, perhaps, the resources that are going to shelter us from the chaos of nature, from dangerous other tribes or animals. Resources and the security they give us, perhaps, a natural desire. The desire for rest, the desire to recover and relax and to take it easy after laboring for a while. The desire for anger. How do we think about anger? Well, I think that there is an appropriate anger in the sense that to protect our borders, to protect the integrity of ourselves, of our body, of those we love, and of our property and of our livelihood, and not just ourselves, but our broader culture, the values that are at the heart of it. The value of freedom and equality and different things like this. There is, I think, an appropriate anger, an appropriate aggression and energy in the service of that which we love, and in the service of protecting those that we love. I suppose the best way I could say this is if one has a child, the anger and the aggressive energy marshaled to protect the well-being of that child, the anger integrated in the service of love. Again, a natural desire. And I'm going to explain what I mean by natural desire in a minute. The desire for success. Now we're getting a bit more abstract. That means, the success in one sense means the realization of our telos, the realization of our aims. So the desire, that we find a partner, that we have enough food to eat, that we have enough security of resources, that we are able to rest and relax, and that we are able to protect those that we love, that we're able to prosper, and that we're able to be successful in a broad sense. Another desire, it's kind of presupposed by the previous desires. And then, a desire for basic respect as a human being, to be treated as someone, to be treated with a basic respect, and not to be treated as inferior or other, but to be treated in as a brother and a sister, as someone who is an equal. I think we all have that desire for respect too. Now, what do I mean? I'm just kind of asserting these natural desires here. What do I mean, natural desires? Like, maybe there's some debate around these ones I'm suggesting here. Well, what I'm trying to say is that if these desires are not realized, like they're the presupposition of consciousness as a human being, like you, the viewer, wouldn't exist if your ancestors hadn't accomplished these goals. Sex and procreation, and you've got a new generation, and giving birth to children. And those natural desires need to be fulfilled for you to be here watching this. Same with food. Your ancestors had to survive. Physiologically, their bodies had to be fed. Resources, they had to have enough shelter and protection and property to have endured through their lifetime. Rest, balancing out their the anger and the ability to protect and enshrine the things that they love. They would have had to achieve success as defined as the realization of these previous telos, these previous aims, goals, and a basic sense of or that respect. Now, I'm not saying that our ancestors all necessarily achieved all of these aims in an ultimate sense, but I'm saying that our ancestors and us, and us, you and me, human beings here, like this is the structure of human desire. Like our ancestors had to desire these things. They desired these things naturally because they facilitate life. They are preconditions for a healthy existence, and without them, I guess that's how I'm thinking of it. If you negate these principles, if someone is deeply disrespected, if someone does ultimately fail and doesn't achieve these aims, then that can lead to a very dark place. The soul can go to a very dark place. So I wanted to, let's continue our examination of the notion of sin, because another way of thinking about sin, remember the Greek word is hamartia. Hamartia means to miss the mark. And so whilst we have these natural desires as human beings, which are natural in the sense that we want them and need them, and if they are not realized, we can die, or we can die without food. We will die without food, simply. But then also without giving birth to new life, humanity would have gone extinct. So we wouldn't be here to. It's like it's like a deep precondition. These natural desires, they're deep preconditions. Without them, this wouldn't be life. Human life wouldn't be. So they're natural enough desires, but they can become perverted. They can become twisted, corrupted, and changed and warped, these desires. And so this is drawing from the Western Latin Christian theological tradition. These are the 7 deadly sins. And so the 7 deadly sins are in relationship to our natural desires. So we have natural desires, and then we have the 7 deadly sins. So our desire for sex becomes lust. Our desire for food becomes glut. Our desire for resources becomes greed. Our desire for rest becomes sloth. Our desire for anger becomes wrath. Our desire for success becomes envy of other people's success. Our desire for respect becomes pride. So I think that's a really helpful way of understanding sin. There is a natural telos to our desires. We have desires as human beings. We have aims, ends, purposes as human beings, things that we want, that we naturally want. And if we didn't want them, if our ancestors didn't want them and didn't achieve them and weren't successful in achieving them, then human consciousness, human being would not be. I hope I've explained that. Like, you couldn't view this video, I couldn't make it, because we would be extinct. So the condition of human life is these natural desires. So they're natural desires, so that's the positive aspect of it. But the negative aspect of it is that these desires can become perverted. Now, what do I mean by perverted? How do natural desires become perverted? By excess. That's the word to use, excess. So hamartia, this Greek word, missing the mark. A way in which we miss the mark, the ultimate telos, the ultimate aim, is through excess, by excessive indulgence in our desires, in our natural desires. So a definition of success is a quantity of something that is more than necessary. I want to emphasize the word quantity here because quantity is something different from quality. And again, we get into this heaven and earth thing, because quantity relates to the quantitative and to the sensation and to the fact and to everything that is occurring on this horizontal dimension of the earth symbol that I've introduced earlier. So it's a quantity. An excess is a quantity of something that is more than necessary. Now, we need to understand what is meant by necessary, and I've alluded to it a bit before, but we're going to unpack that a bit more. So let's look at this. 1 second. Natural desire, food. If we don't have food for a long time, we die of starvation. That's what happens. And so we need food. Life is sustained by food. I'm not saying anything radical about that. So we desire food. So there is a telos, an aim towards food, which you, the viewer, realize this aim every day. Okay. It's not necessarily like you kind of choose it. It's like it comes in and possesses you. The spirit of your desire for food comes in and takes the reins of your personality and says, look, hunger, food time. And then you, the viewer, act out that desire. You just go and do that. You go and eat, you have it, food, and then you sustain your life by that. But the principle with excess is this principle of necessity, or enough, as I've put it here. So there's kind of like a natural border, a natural domain in which the telos of food is realized until you're satiated, until your hunger stops. And so that would be the natural fulfillment of the desire. You eat enough food to sustain your life. And enough. What do we mean by enough? Well, let's unpack that a little bit. What do we mean by a quantity of something that is more than necessary? What do I mean by necessary? What do I mean by enough? Well, remember this concept of theosis I introduced at the beginning? From an Eastern Orthodox theology, from that viewpoint, as I understand it, the ultimate aim is theosis, is coming into communion with God, the mystical union with God, or in Christianity, the personality of Christ. So Christ is like a meta personality, or like an ideal, or a paradigm, or an exemplar, which is held up is kind of like a standard of an ultimate telos towards which all human personalities aim. And so the notion is that natural desires in such a context are lower order desires relative to the incarnation, the embodiment of the Spirit of Christ. I'm going to get into what the Spirit of Christ means when I talk about virtue in a minute. But for now, we just need to know that enough and necessary in the theological context in which I'm explaining it is enough to survive, to live, but live for what purpose? Not just to live in itself, not just like mere biological survival. What's it called in biology? Survival and reproduction. This isn't a merely materialistic or biological narrative operating across a horizontal dimension. This is a theology, and we have the notion of earth, yes, but we have the notion of heaven too. And so the idea is that I eat to survive, to fulfill myself, but then I survive and to fulfill myself to become divine, to achieve a theosis, to come into union with God, to draw my soul closer to God, to restore the nous, to restore my true, to heal, to become who I truly am in a deep spiritual sense, to recover the nous, to recover the vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful, to recover the knowledge of God, to come into communion with God. All of these ideas I've talked about and alluded to earlier, all of those things have their ultimate apotheosis, using the word theosis there, you know, the ultimate divine aim. They all kind of aspire to basically the idea of God. And so that's there's kind of like an ontological hierarchy at play here. So we have our natural desires, maybe lower down the hierarchy, which are biological or material desires, but we also then have our spiritual desires. And the notion is that a way of uniting heaven and earth is through the realization of our earthly desires, but they are not ends in themselves. Basically, that's my point. They're not self-sustaining ends in themselves. They are instead aims which serve a higher reality, serve a higher spiritual aim, and that is theosis. So that's how I mean the word enough and necessary here. Necessary and enough to then facilitate spiritual aims, the aim of theosis. Whereas perverted desire goes beyond that enough. It transgresses that border, that natural order, that natural telos, and actually it becomes food in and of itself. I want more food and more food and more food and more food. And this is the pattern of gluttony. Gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins in the Western theological tradition, and in the Eastern, I think. So gluttony is a pattern of sin, and what it is a corruption of our natural desire for food. And so the pattern of gluttony has now made food our God. Instead of God our God, now food is the God. Food is the end in and of itself. And so the pattern sustains itself. And it's occurring, you see, across this earth, this horizontal dimension. And it's losing sight of this heaven, the spiritual dimension. So what was a natural desire with a wholesome telos becomes an obsession, an end in itself, and an addiction. The desire becomes disordered and split off from the broader personality. Now, I want to emphasize that this is all really practical and real stuff, because the pattern of gluttony leads physically, in fact, it leads to obesity, and obesity is in fact the cause of a lot of of medical disease, like like heart disease is like a leading cause of death, and heart disease is usually associated to obesity, and obesity is usually associated to this pattern of gluttony, you see. So I want to really make the point to you that sin is not this abstract theological concern of religious people. It is a reality. People who live in sin corrupt the body and die. So if the pattern of gluttony takes hold in the life, one becomes obese and one gives way to all sorts of disease, and that's not good. It's as simple as that. When I say that's not good, I mean that's not healthy. That doesn't bring us closer to health and wholeness. In this example with food, the health of the body. As I've been trying to make the point, it's not all about the health of the body, it's also about the health of the spirit. The health of the body is like a facilitator to, or vessel for, the health of the spirit. That's the argument I'm trying to make to you. But it's a necessary condition, you see. If the body is diseased, then how can the spirit heal? So I hope that's all making sense. We've got a really natural desire here for food. It's natural. If we don't desire food, we die. But the notion is that we should, I don't know if should's the right word, but the natural telos, the natural aim, the natural playing out of that desire is operating according to a principle of sufficiency, of what's necessary, of what's enough. And this is kind of an intuitive idea, what's enough food? Who am I to tell you what enough food is? But it's a natural desire. You know what enough is. You kind of intuitively understand that. And the Christian theological tradition would say that it's enough to facilitate the accomplishment of spiritual aims, or the spiritual telos of our being. And if we lose sight of that enough, that necessity, that what is necessary, that sufficiency principle, then we just have our horizontal desire, and we have now addiction. Addiction for food, addiction to food, addiction to drugs, addiction to sex, addiction to power, addiction to status, all forms of addiction and obsession. And this is the nature of sin. There's an image, Sarah Goldfarb from Requiem for a Dream. Yes, I wanted to just pause here and recommend to you to go and watch the film Requiem for a Dream, because that is a perfect illustration of the nature of sin. There you have characters descend into hell to move away from health, to move towards disease, to move towards fragmentation and disorder and death, and for their lives to fall into utter chaos on account of perverted desires. And again, perverted desire, another word for perverted desire is this Greek word hamartia, to missing the mark, to straying. I think it says in the Bible, in the New Testament, wide is the way that leadeth unto destruction, and narrow is the way unto life. So here's the natural boundary of the desire, the enough, the sufficiency, the necessary, the narrow way unto life, unto the ultimate telos. And there's the wide capacity of perverted desires to go all ways, everywhere. And if you want to see that principle of sin, that principle of the wide way unto destruction, dramatized in a shocking way, watch the film Requiem for a Dream. So what is the cure to to the disease of perverted desire. Well, this is where we get the idea of virtue, the 7 heavenly virtues, which are actually balms or cures for the disease of sin. And those virtues are chastity for lust, and the virtue of chastity for the sin of lust, the virtue of temperance for the sin of glut, the virtue of charity for the sin of greed, the virtue of diligence for the sin of sloth, the virtue of patience for the sin of wrath, the virtue of gratitude for the sin of envy, and the virtue of humility for the sin of pride. Now, the virtues and the 7 heavenly virtues and the 7 deadly sins are a topic that I'm going to explore in more depth. I'm going to make more presentations on them because there's a lot to unpack in what I've just said. But I'm going to press on with the presentation here. But I'd like you to think about virtue in this way. We've said that sin is an excess. We've said that sin is an excess going beyond what is necessary, what is sufficient. And so there's something natural about that too, because we naturally desire sex and food and resources and all of these different things. We naturally desire them, but just as a bush grows naturally, it grows into an excess, you see. That's what a wild forest is like an excess of nature. Or if you, another way I think about it with my beard is, or if you just think of it with your hair, if you leave your hair to grow, it grows into excess. It naturally grows, and it's good that it naturally grows because it's like the way of nature. But if you just leave it, then it will tend unto wildness and excess. And so what we need to do is we need to temper that natural course of things. And so we cut the beard, or we have a haircut. And the art of the haircut is an art of tempering to the appropriate, to the enoughness, to what is necessary, to what is sufficient. And so I've got an image here of the trimming of a hedge. And virtue is very much like the trimming of a hedge, because sin is like the excess on the right of the bush, which goes onto all this excess. And virtue is about noticing the excess, holding our sins before our eyes, being aware and conscious of the excess, and repenting. And repenting meaning changing our heart, changing our ways, changing our thoughts, words, and actions, changing how we're acting, changing how we're being in the world according to a principle, according to the opposite principle of the excess. And so that's where chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, gratitude, and humility are the virtues, the principles, the tempering influences which come in and trim the hedge of the excess of our sin. So sin's operating across this horizontal dimension that has an imminent telos. And what I mean by an imminent telos is we want food for food's sake. We want, in Requiem for a Dream, we want heroin, or we want drugs for their own sake. We want that drug, and our desires become narrowed and imminent to that desire structure. That is all that matters. Food is all that matters. Sex is all that matters. Power is all that matters. This is the nature of the passions. This is the nature of sin. Passion. So some of the associations between this imminent telos are passion, earth, of nature, the eye of the body, the outer eye, the eye that looks out, just always sees the food, sees like the desires of the body, you see, and that whole telos and that whole aim, which is natural, which I've hopefully emphasized, which is natural enough, all of that, but it's immanent unto itself. It's self-justifying. It's self-validating. There's nothing higher than it. There's nothing more transcendent than it. There's nothing of a more ultimate reality than it. Whereas the transcendent telos is the vertical dimension of heaven coming in, which is virtue, heaven, of spirit, the eye of the heart, the inner eye. This is this concept of the nous, the understanding, the perception of what is our true spiritual nature, the perception of our inner nature, or the nature of God, or the nature of Christ. And so another way of thinking about Christ, when I use that word Christ, is that Christ is the personality that embodies these 7 heavenly virtues. So Christ is the telos, the ultimate aim for the Christian, is the incarnation of the principle of Christ, the personality of Christ, the spirit of Christ, which is each of these 7 virtues is embodied in Christ. And so that principle of Christ is needed to temper the virtues. If the natural desires tend unto excess and lead to hell, and I mean hell very definitely, go watch Requiem for a Dream and tell me that's not hell. That film chronicles the descent into hell that many go through in this life, who are under the influence of demonic powers, they're under the influence of demonic passions. They are full of sin. The nous is entirely corrupt, and it's not full of sin. Let me point my finger and judge them and say, it's not that outer vision of sin, like I said at the beginning, like, oh, how full of sin they are. I'm saying from within, the structure of their desires have become perverted and corrupted in the way that I've hopefully laid out in this presentation. So go watch Requiem for a Dream and tell me that's not hell. And tell me, the thing is that we all have these natural desires. So like there is kind of like an eternal tendency or temptation towards this hellish state of being, and we need a tempering influence if we are to avoid that going to hell, basically, in that sense. And if you just go watch Requiem for a Dream, if you want a vision of what I mean by hell in this sense. Oh yes, so I've got a bit of a laying out now visually of everything I've said so far. Yeah, okay, so this should sum up the presentation. What we've got is different telos here. Each of these circles here is the telos, an aim. And these passions down here are hamartia, missing the mark, missing the ultimate aim of Christ or God. And so these are all hamartia. They're telos, but they're disordered telos. They are the passions are a disordering of the desires, and it leads unto war, to fragmentation, to discord, to disease, to death, and to hell. And again, go watch Requiem for a Dream if you want to know what I mean by that. And I'm going to be doing more work on the sins and on the passions in future. But wrath is one of the 7 deadly sins that leads to war. Envy, the story of Cain and Abel, leads to discord between brothers and sisters, between people, envy. And there's all sorts of ways in which these passions, in which the 7 deadly sins, lead to a hellish state of being. And so all that's associated with this hamartia, this erring from the true telos. The true telos in Christian theology is Christ, and Christ, as I've explained, is the incarnation or the source of the 7 heavenly virtues. Chastity, I'm going to have to remind myself here. Chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, gratitude, and humility. There's so much to unpack in that, and I'm going to in future presentations. But I'm highlighting here, hopefully, a framework and a grammar and an ontological vision for you about how to understand what sin is. And it's really practical and psychological, because where the virtues are lacking, sin is reigning, so to speak. Like sin has dominion over our hearts when the virtues are not operating in our lives. So here at the top of the image, we've got a vision of the ordering of the desires, love as the power which orders the desires. And this leads to peace, harmony, health, life, and heaven. So that's what's meant by, from at least a psychological perspective. There's many more metaphysical and theological things to be said about this, but from a purely psychological perspective, Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. What that means is that Christ is the ultimate telos of Christ is the principle which should be at the top of our hierarchy of desires. And love is the principle by which our desires become ordered, and we purify ourselves of the passions. And that's what catharsis means, is a purification. So we exercise the demons of the passions, we get rid of and go to war with these demonic influences of the passions, which lead to war, fragmentation, discord, disease, death, and hell. We purge our souls of them, we purify through the catharsis, and through theoria, through illumination. We see through the illumination, the theoria of the nous, we see the heavenly virtues, their meaning for us, their meaning for us as individuals, for our families, for our cultures and our broader communities. We see the importance of those morals, of those virtues, of the incarnation of those virtues. And we see how those virtues have their source in Christ ontologically. And what I mean ontologically is that we're operating on this dimension of heaven, as I've laid out earlier, instead of this dimension of merely earth, because it is the dimension of merely earth, merely sensation, merely passion, just food for food's sake, sex for sex sake, resources, money for money's sake, making those ends an end in themselves in a purely horizontal way. That is the cause of sin and passion, because there's no trump card, let's say. There's no reality higher than those things. So those telos just self-perpetuate. So it's just survival and reproduction. And as the biological story would say, we are merely biological beings on that vision. Whereas when I say Christ is the highest ontological reality, what I mean is that that is the ordering principle, which the highest of the high, which trumps and transcends the passions. The passions and sin are overcome through the incarnation of Christ. And what I mean, bringing that more down to earth, is the incarnation of the 7 heavenly virtues, which I've laid out, which temper these 7 natural desires, which I've laid out. So I'm going to end the presentation there. I think it's that's an appropriate place to end it. And there's a lot I've said there. There's a lot of theology going on. I've laid out, hopefully, an ontological vision of heaven, the vertical dimension, and earth, the horizontal dimension. I've laid out the idea of telos, aim, purpose, end, of Christ or God as the ultimate telos, and how without that as the ultimate telos, without that tempering influence of virtue, and Christ being like the ultimate incarnation of virtue, with and a moral exemplar in that sense, an exemplar of the possibility of the overcoming of sin. So when people say Christ died for our sins, this is a meaning of that, but perhaps not the meaning of that, but a way of interpreting what is meant by Christ died for our sins. Well, I'm showing you here in this ontological vision, Christ is the principle by which, like the portal or the doorway or the opening up towards the overcoming of sin and passion and the passions, and that's made possible by the higher ontological reality of Christ. Ontological just means being. So there is a transcendent spiritual reality which is greater than the excesses of our passions. That's the basic point. And the thing is about this is that I feel like we kind of know that this is true. Like if and there's a I think it's Proverbs 9:10 which says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that's kind of the kind of angle I'm coming from, is like, if we fear and if we really understand, where the passions lead, where sins lead, they lead to war, to discourse, to hell, to hellish realities. If we really understand that and understand how our desires, our natural desires, are inclined to sin, they're inclined to become corrupt. If we really perceive that, then that can fill us with an integrated fear, a wise fear, a fear that says, oh, I better be careful about thoughts, words, and actions. I better be careful about how my being is organized, how my personality is organized, because there is this proclivity unto sin, which is part of the natural desires I have as a human being. And so the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If we really understand what sin means, then maybe we can turn from it. Maybe we can live in virtue, and we can aspire unto the life of the saints, unto a holy life, and the ultimate ontological fountain, the source, the water of life for all saints and holiness and righteousness, is, according to Christian theology, Christ. So hopefully that was a useful presentation. Hopefully that was illuminating and informative. I'd really like to know what you think, so please do leave a comment below. I drew here mainly on Eastern Orthodox theology. I think that's what I'm kind of coming to understand best at the moment, I suppose. I think it's a tremendously profound vision of sin. It's a kind of mystical vision of sin, an understanding of sin from within, from the heart. And I think it's really illuminating and really powerful. And I hope that you've got a lot from this presentation. And I don't want the idea of Christ using, having Christ here at the top as the ultimate telos, the top of the ontological hierarchy. I don't want that to put people off, because I think this is really, as I understand it, there's like a deep theological tradition behind all of this. And I'm trying to make the necessary psychological case to talk in that language without necessarily going too deep into the metaphysics, because although I have gone into the metaphysics here with the ontology, because Christ, even the word Christ and Christianity has a lot of cultural baggage and associations to it. I want to show that there's a way of understanding it what Christ means psychologically, inwardly, in relationship to our heart, our soul, how we live in the world, how we think, how we act, how we speak to people, how we live, how we live our lives every day. And there's definitely a tradition of interpretation and understanding in Christianity which says that Christ opens the possibility of redemption from sin. Christ died for our sins. And so one way of understanding that is that Christ is the model, the paradigm, the blueprint, the exemplar by which sin is overcome. And we need to overcome sin in the sense that I've laid out, because sin does lead to hell. Like, it leads to disease and death and strife and discord and chaos. And if we understand that, then we are filled with a fear of the Lord. And then if we fear that hell, then perhaps we could aspire to heaven. We could aspire to the imitation of Christ, to live as Christ lived. I really hope that was helpful. I'd love to hear your comments below. Thank you so much for your attention. And I will be doing a series on sin. I think I'm going to be going deeper into virtue and sin and unpacking that model of the 7 heavenly virtues and the 7 deadly sins, because I think there's so much rich and important insight in that theory. Thanks again for listening.